In today's climate, there are many uncertainties. The executive branch has a few options to handle situations throughout the country. The president can declare a national emergency or disaster, and under that declaration, there are certain actions the executive branch can take. First, let us look at some of the background and history. The National Emergencies Act, NEA, is a key piece of U.S. federal legislation enacted in 1976. Its main purpose is to regulate and limit the powers of the president when declaring a national emergency. The act was passed in response to growing concerns in the 1970s over the unchecked and prolonged use of emergency powers by U.S. presidents, especially during times of war and domestic crisis. Before the NEA, presidents had invoked various statutory emergency powers, many without time limits, some dating back to the New Deal and World War II. These powers allowed presidents to bypass certain legislative constraints, often with limited congressional oversight. By the 1970s, Congress sought to rein in these powers amid concerns over executive overreach, particularly following the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War. Key provisions of the National Emergencies Act: Presidential Declaration of National Emergency. The president must formally declare a national emergency and specify the legal authorities being activated. This declaration must be published in the Federal Register and communicated to Congress. Congressional oversight. The president must report to Congress every 6 months during the state of emergency. Originally, the act allowed Congress to terminate an emergency by a concurrent resolution, but this was weakened by the 1983 INS versus Chadha Supreme Court decision, which ruled such legislative vetoes unconstitutional. Currently, Congress can end a national emergency by passing a joint resolution, subject to presidential veto. Time limits and renewal. A declared emergency expires after 1 year unless the president renews it. Renewals must also be published and reported. Public accountability requires the recording and public listing of emergency declarations and the statutes invoked, maintained by the Federal Register and the Library of Congress. Impact and use. Since the law's enactment, presidents have declared dozens of national emergencies, covering a wide range of issues including economic sanctions, e.g., against Iran, North Korea, or terrorist organizations; national security threats, e.g. after 9/11, public health crises, e.g. the COVID-19 pandemic; immigration enforcement, e.g. Trump's 2019 border wall funding declaration. As of 2025, many of these emergencies remain active, often renewed annually. Controversies and criticism, overuse, and longevity. Some emergencies remain in effect for decades, raising concerns about whether they are still justified. Presidential overreach. Critics argue the NEA still gives the executive branch too much discretion. Weak congressional checks. The need for a presidential signature to end an emergency hampers Congress's ability to act as a true check. The National Emergencies Act, NEA, does not establish a strict legal threshold or detailed criteria that a president must meet to declare a national emergency. Instead, it grants the president broad discretion to determine when a national emergency exists. Key points on the threshold 1. No specific definition in the NEA. The statute does not define what constitutes a national emergency. The determination is left entirely to the president's judgment. 2. Procedural requirements. Only the president must: O. Issue a formal proclamation. O. Identify the specific statutory powers being activated. O. Publish the declaration in the Federal Register. O. Notify Congress of the action. 3. Legal authority must exist elsewhere. The NEA itself does not grant emergency powers. It activates existing statutory powers contained in other federal laws. More than 120 such laws are currently tied to emergencies. The President must cite the specific statutes that authorize the actions he or she plans to take. Fourth congressional check is limited. Congress can attempt to terminate an emergency through a joint resolution, but it is subject to a presidential veto, meaning a 2/3 majority in both chambers is required to override it. 5. Judicial review is rare. Courts have generally shown reluctance to second-guess presidential declarations of emergencies unless a clear constitutional or statutory violation is shown. Implications. Because the law lacks substantive criteria, it allows for a low threshold. Essentially, the President believes a national emergency exists and follows the procedural steps required by the NEA. This has raised constitutional and political concerns, especially in instances where the declared emergency may be perceived as politically motivated or unjustified by facts, such as when congressional Democrats had claims concerning President Trump's 2019 border wall emergency. This, if true, can cause issues. The long-standing national emergency declarations used to maintain sanctions, some lasting over 30 years. Let us take a look at the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a foundational piece of U.S. federal law that allows the President of the United States to deploy U.S. military forces domestically under certain circumstances to restore public order, suppress rebellion, or enforce federal law. Overview of the Insurrection Act enacted. Originally in 1792, revised multiple times. Current version codified mainly in 10 U.S. Code sections, 251 to 255. Purpose: to provide legal authority for the President to use military, including federalized National Guard, forces within the United States under exceptional circumstances. Scope. It is one of the rare exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act, 1878, which otherwise prohibits the use of federal troops for domestic law enforcement. So when can the President use it? The law provides 3 primary situations in which the President may invoke the Insurrection Act. 1. At the request of a state. 10 U.S. Code Section 251. If a state legislature or governor, if the legislature cannot be convened, requests help to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combinations, or conspiracies, President may deploy troops to assist with restoring order. 2. Enforcement of federal law, 10 U.S. Code, Section 252. If a situation makes it impracticable to enforce U.S. federal law through regular means, e.g. law enforcement is overwhelmed or obstructed, the President may act unilaterally without a state request. 3. Protection of civil rights and against rebellion, 10 U.S. Code Section 253. When insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combinations, or conspiracies hinder the execution of federal law or deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, especially when state authorities fail or refuse to protect those rights. Often invoked during civil rights crises, e.g., school desegregation in the 1950s and 1960s, historical examples of use, year, President context, 1807, Thomas Jefferson, suppression of Aaron Burr's rebellion, 1861, Abraham Lincoln, used at the outbreak of the Civil War, 1957, Dwight Eisenhower, enforced desegregation at Little Rock Central High School, 1962, John F. Kennedy, University of Mississippi integration, James Meredith case, 1967, Lyndon B. Johnson, response to Detroit riots. 1992, George H.W. Bush, after Los Angeles riots following Rodney King verdict. Note, the act was not used in response to the 2020 George Floyd protests, though it was heavily debated. Limits and controversies, presidential discretion. The president has broad authority to determine when conditions justify invoking the act. Limited judicial oversight. Courts are unlikely to challenge the president's decision unless it clearly violates constitutional rights. Risk of abuse. Critics warn that broad discretion could allow for militarization of domestic law enforcement and suppression of lawful protests. Calls for reform. Several lawmakers and civil rights groups have urged greater congressional oversight or clearer legal standards. There is an interesting controversy concerning the Insurrection Act, and that is the Posse Comitatus Act. The Posse Comitatus Act is a critical U.S. federal law that limits the ability of the federal government to use the military for domestic law enforcement purposes. It is a cornerstone of American civil-military relations, designed to reinforce the principle that civilian authorities, not the military, are responsible for domestic law enforcement in the United States. Overview of the Posse Comitatus Act. Enacted 1878. Codified 18 U.S. Code 1385. Original purpose: to end the use of federal troops in southern states during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Key principle: prohibits the use of the U.S. Army or Air Force to execute domestic laws unless explicitly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. Legal exceptions to the PCA 1. Insurrection Act, 10 U.S. Code 251 to 255. Authorizes use of military in domestic crises like rebellion or unlawful obstruction of law 2. National Guard under state control, not bound by PCA. Governors may use Guard for law enforcement during emergencies 3. Specific congressional authorizations of, for example, drug interdiction efforts, e.g. 10 U.S. Code 124. Disaster response under the Stafford Act. Notable incidents involving PCA considerations event. Issue: PCA applied. 1992. Los Angeles riots. Military deployed to assist in restoring order after Rodney King verdict. Insurrection Act invoked, so PCA exception applied. Hurricane Katrina, 2005. Proposals for federal military role in disaster relief, not invoked due to PCA concerns. George Floyd protests, 2020. Discussions of active duty deployment against protesters. PCA prevented federal military use. National Guard used instead, January 6, 2021. Delays in deploying National Guard. PCA not directly invoked. Guard under state-federal coordination, legal and political significance. The PCA reinforces the separation between civilian law enforcement and the military. It protects civil liberties by limiting the president's ability to use armed forces as a domestic police force. Violations are rare and difficult to prosecute due to the Act's vague language and limited enforcement mechanisms. Contemporary debates calls for clarification. Some legal scholars argue that the PCA should be modernized to address the increased militarization of police, or the blurred lines between National Guard and active duty roles, executive authority. Ongoing debates about how much discretion the president should have in emergencies involving civil unrest or terrorism, role of technology. New concerns about the use of military surveillance technology, e.g. drones, facial recognition, in domestic settings. Here is a comparative analysis of the Insurrection Act and the Posse Comitatus Act. Comparative analysis: Insurrection Act versus Posse Comitatus Act. Feature: Insurrection Act, Posse Comitatus Act, PCA. Enacted 1792, amended multiple times, most recently in 2006 and 2007. 1878. Codified. 10 U.S. Code sections 251 to 255. 18 U.S. Code 1385. Purpose: authorizes the President to deploy military forces domestically. Restricts the use of the U.S. Army and Air Force for law enforcement within the U.S. scope of application. Situations involving insurrection, civil disorder, or obstruction of law. General domestic law enforcement duties by federal military personnel. Branches affected: all branches, including National Guard when federalized, primarily Army and Air Force, Navy and Marine Corps covered by DoD policy. Exception to PCA? Yes, it is a statutory exception allowing domestic deployment. No. Prohibits such use unless explicitly authorized by Congress. Requires state request. Only under 10 U.S.C. 251. Not applicable. Judicial oversight. Extremely limited. Broad presidential discretion. Strong statutory limits, but violations rarely litigated. Risk of abuse high due to vague thresholds and potential for political misuse lower due to its restrictive nature. Key differences summarized. The Posse Comitatus Act is a prohibition. It forbids the military from engaging in civilian law enforcement without congressional authorization. The Insurrection Act is an exception. It provides the President with legal authority to override Posse Comitatus restrictions under specific circumstances. Modern use and debates. 1. George Floyd protests, 2020. After the killing of George Floyd, mass protests and some violent unrest broke out across the U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy active duty military forces to suppress protests. Critics argued, such use would have politicized the military. The protests, while large and sometimes unruly, did not meet the threshold of insurrection under the Act. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, particularly General Mark Milley, expressed concern over using the military against American citizens. Ultimately, the act was not invoked, though National Guard troops under state control were widely deployed. 2nd, January 6th, Capitol attack, 2021. A violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol in an effort to overturn the 2020 election results. The D.C. National Guard was not immediately deployed, raising questions about why the Insurrection Act or similar federal authority was not activated to protect Congress. Debate centered around, the delays and hesitations by the Department of Defense. Whether President Trump could have or should have invoked the act or deliberately chose not to. In this case, use of the Insurrection Act might have been justified under Section 252 or Section 253, given the breakdown of federal law enforcement capacity and obstruction of federal functions, i.e., the Electoral College certification. Current debates and proposed reforms, concerns about the Insurrection Act, overbroad presidential authority. The language of the statute gives the president wide discretion with little oversight. Potential for misuse in politically sensitive moments, particularly around elections or civil unrest. Lack of accountability. No requirement for preemptive congressional approval or judicial review. Proposals for reform. Clarify the standards for what constitutes an insurrection or domestic violence. Require congressional consultation or authorization before invocation, except in extreme emergencies. Mandate transparency in the legal justifications and chain of command during deployment. Periodic review of existing emergency declarations and use of military domestically. Final assessment. The Insurrection Act remains a powerful but controversial tool of presidential authority. While it provides necessary emergency powers, its vague language and lack of procedural safeguards have made it a focal point in debates over the balance between national security and civil liberties. The Posse Comitatus Act continues to serve as an essential legal barrier to the military's involvement in civilian affairs, but its force depends on the limitations of exceptions like the Insurrection Act. So how can any of these acts be utilized during the government shutdown? In the context of a federal government shutdown, the Posse Comitatus Act, the Insurrection Act, and the National Emergencies Act have distinct roles and limited but potentially consequential intersections. Here's a structured explanation of how or whether each of these laws could be used during a shutdown and under what conditions. Context. What happens during a government shutdown? A government shutdown occurs when Congress fails to pass appropriation bills or a continuing resolution to fund federal agencies. As a result, non-essential federal employees are furloughed. Essential services, for example, national security, air traffic control, emergency response, continue. The president does not gain additional powers unless a separate legal justification is invoked, e.g. declaring a national emergency or invoking the Insurrection Act. 1. Posse Comitatus Act and shutdowns. Can the military be used for domestic law enforcement during a shutdown? No, the Posse Comitatus Act still applies. The PCA remains in effect regardless of whether the government is shut down. It continues to prohibit federal military forces, Army, Air Force, and by policy, Navy and Marines from participating in law enforcement. No new powers are granted during a shutdown. Exception. The military can be used for non-law enforcement functions that are considered essential, such as defense of critical infrastructure, continuity of operations at the Pentagon, emergency response under existing authorizations, e.g., FEMA missions. 2. Insurrection Act and shutdowns. Can the president use the Insurrection Act during a shutdown? Yes, but only under strict conditions. The Insurrection Act is one of the few statutes that allows the president to deploy federal military forces domestically, but only when 1. Insurrection or rebellion occurs against the U.S. government. 2. Law enforcement is overwhelmed or unable to enforce federal law. 3. Citizens are being deprived of their constitutional rights and state governments failed to protect them. A government shutdown does not automatically qualify as such a condition. However, if a shutdown led to widespread unrest, looting, or rebellion due to lack of services or economic disruption, the president could argue that the conditions for invoking the Insurrection Act have been met. Important caveat, it would likely be viewed as politically explosive and legally questionable to invoke the Insurrection Act solely because of shutdown-related protests or unrest. Courts have typically deferred to presidential discretion in interpreting the act, but this would still provoke constitutional scrutiny. Visit 3. National Emergencies Act and shutdowns. Can the president declare a national emergency during a shutdown? Yes. The NEA can be invoked independently of funding status. The National Emergencies Act allows the president to declare a national emergency at his or her discretion and unlock a range of emergency powers defined in over 120 other statutes, some of which do not require new appropriations. How this could apply during a shutdown. If the shutdown causes threats to national security, major disruptions to public safety or critical infrastructure, collapse of essential services, e.g., food distribution, federal prisons, border control. Then the president could declare a national emergency under the NEA trigger emergency statutes that allow for reallocation of existing funds, e.g. under the Defense Production Act or military construction statutes, deployment of the National Guard or other resources. Limitations. Emergency declarations don't restore general funding to the government. They cannot be used to circumvent congressional appropriations in most cases, as litigated in the 2019 to 2020 Trump border wall emergency. Congressional oversight still applies, though it is politically and procedurally difficult to override such declarations. Hypothetical scenarios. 1. Scenario: economic collapse from prolonged shutdown to riots. President could invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy military forces to restore order if civil authorities fail. 2. Scenario: border enforcement collapses due to DHS funding lapse. President could declare a national emergency under the NEA to redirect funds for temporary security measures, as attempted in 2019. 3. Scenario: public health emergency due to shutdown-induced failure of CDC/FDA NEA might be invoked to activate emergency public health authorities. Conclusion. In short, a government shutdown does not suspend the Posse Comitatus Act. Military law enforcement remains prohibited. The Insurrection Act can be used if civil disorder or rebellion results, but this is a last resort measure. The National Emergencies Act offers the most flexible tool, allowing the president to access certain emergency powers if the shutdown creates critical threats. Why is all of this important? Because each of us needs to know the truth, and not the skewed rhetoric which will most likely come to distort the facts. Knowledge is power. Power to make your own decisions and opinions. Here are Indigo-Enterprises. We strive to bring the facts, to reveal the truth, and let people decide for themselves. The truth is out there. Let's go find it together. Thank you for joining us today. Please click like, and please share with all you know. Leave us a comment if you have topics for us, and if you really like our content, please subscribe to see more. Thank you, and God bless.